In recent weeks, the main news about Ukraine has been Ukraine's request to Germany to be able to use its Leopard II modern battle tanks in combat. And in this video, I want to find out why Ukraine wants to use them and why Germany is so hesitant to let them do so. Ukrainian President Zelensky had asked the NATO alliance for 300 Leopard II battle tanks. The kinds of tanks that the Ukrainians have been using thus far in the conflict are mostly old Soviet-type tanks. So these include the T-64, the T-72, and the T-80. These kinds of tanks go back to the Soviet era, and many of them are very similar to the tanks being used by the Russians. The Ukrainians, of course, because of their successes on the battlefield, have also been able to salvage and re-equip quite a lot of Russian tanks and are using those against their opponents. But they feel that modern Western tanks would be a step above this and help them in their future counter-offensives, as in the previous August, the Ukrainian forces were able to retake large areas of the country around Kharkiv and as well on the southern front around Kherson, and they will likely be hoping to keep up that momentum going into the spring when winter is over for a new offensive. And for this, they say that they need tanks to be able to create an armored thrust for the infantry to follow behind. The first to respond positively to this request was on the 14th of January 2023, when the United Kingdom's government said that they would supply Challenger 2 tanks, 14 in total, British-made modern tanks to be sent to Ukraine. Now, this is important because this is the first time that a Western nation or an ally of Ukraine has sent modern equipment. Tanks had already been sent before, but these were largely from Eastern Bloc countries that were sending in their old tanks, which were then oftentimes replaced by other NATO allies like Germany, the US, or the United Kingdom. However, the importance of the Leopard II is crucial to understanding why Ukraine specifically asked for this tank and why Germany is the key to granting this request. So why is that the case? Well, the Leopard II is a German-made tank. It's one of the best that's out there and most commonly used, especially in NATO countries. Germany currently has a fleet of around 300 to 320 Leopard II tanks, although given the state of the Bundeswehr, we're not entirely sure how many of these are operational and ready to go and how many are lacking parts and are still in storage. But the key fact about the Leopard II is that many NATO countries also use these tanks, and this is a quick graph to show how many Leopard II tanks are owned by various NATO countries. Many of these countries have already supplied various forms of support to Ukraine, whether that's in old weaponry, in munitions, or in financial and logistical support in the past. The crucial thing is that having so many different Leopard tanks in various NATO countries means there is a huge stockpile of them, and this has some advantages for if they were to be supplied to Ukraine. One of them is that there is constantly a supply of new spare parts, as various countries have a large amount of them in storage, and so when inevitably some of the Leopard tanks that would be sent to Ukraine are damaged or need to be reserviced, then this creates a supply chain from various NATO countries to do so. The same goes with ammunition, as Ukrainians have complained in the past about munitions shortages for tanks and other heavy weaponry, and it seems that because so many countries have the tanks, they also have the munitions for them. And finally, having a large fleet of the same tank leads to consistency and also strategic advantage, as in terms of the logistics of supplying and equipping as well as repairing these tanks, it makes it easier for a logistics train to work in Ukraine as it's being supplied by NATO countries. Following Ukraine's request, several countries already stated that they would be willing to send their Leopard tanks, or some of them at least, to Ukraine. These were Finland, Poland, Spain, and Portugal, with a few others making like-minded statements that depending on what their allies would do, they might follow suit. However, Germany did not say that they would, and actually declined completely the idea that they would be sending Leopard tanks to Ukraine at the time. This is important because Germany's refusal meant that no other country could send their Leopard tanks to Ukraine either. This is because the Leopard II is a German design, and so Germany has certain rights when it comes to the re-export of the Leopard tank. So, for example, a country like Poland, which has been very ardent in demanding that Germany allow the export, or that Poland itself would export its Leopard tanks to Ukraine, the only reason that they have the Leopard tank is because the Germans exported it to them in the first place. And as a part of that agreement, there is also a clause about re-exportation, so that the Germans won't export the tank, sell the tank to Poland, and then Poland will go and sell it to an enemy of Germany. But this also means that even though Germany looks favorably upon Ukraine, without German permission, the Poles can't send German tanks to Ukraine. And for this reason, there hasn't been any movement on the Leopard II tanks going to Ukraine, even from member states that own Leopard tanks and want to send them. They can't send them because Germany has blocked it up until now. So why has Germany been so hesitant to send Leopard II tanks to the nominal ally of Ukraine? During the Cold War, the Bundesrepublik Deutschland, or West Germany, was a highly militarized state with a large armed forces. But following the end of the Cold War, these armed forces dwindled significantly as the perceived imminent threat no longer existed. However, of course, in the back of many Germans' minds following the Second World War, militarism was seen as a very negative thing, and even the West German army had certain military restrictions imposed upon it by the Allies following the end of the war. There are no longer any restrictions placed on the United Germany, but there is still a strong tendency of pacifism within both the civil population and within the political classes. And so the idea of German troops or German equipment and weapons being used in the East, the same place where during the Second World War the Wehrmacht and other groups committed atrocities against the population, is something that has caused quite a lot of debate and heated discussion in Germany, indeed in the parliament. And it's probably in the back of Chancellor Olaf Scholz's mind when he doesn't want to send tanks to Ukraine, particularly because, of course, the image of the tank, which enabled the Blitzkrieg in the Second World War and many of the early German successes, is something that isn't lost on the modern German population, and perhaps also not on the Russian population. So into the 1990s and the 2000s, the Bundeswehr and German military spending was largely cut, and the army and the rest of the armed forces dwindled. However, in 2014, when the Russians invaded Crimea, Germany announced that they would be revamping their military somewhat and increasing spending. And in 2022, when the Russians invaded Ukraine once again, they announced a huge increase in spending that by 2024 would see Germany as the country that, after the United States and China, that would spend the most on their military budget, taking it up to $83.5 billion being spent. However, even with this new development that had before seemed completely unthinkable, that Germany would be spending so much on their armed forces, given that their armed forces are strictly defensive only, as it says in their constitution, and Germany is a largely pacifistic state, as it might be called. Well, there are some reasons why the Germans, apart from that, are also cautious about sending Leopard tanks. One is that they don't wish to escalate the situation with the Russians, although the Germans have given quite a lot of aid before to the Ukrainians. Another is the historic context, that they don't want to be seen as sending German tanks to fight against Russians because of the history of the Second World War. Finally, another consideration was that Germany didn't want to be seen out of step with the other allies. And so one of the things that Olaf Scholz said about the Germans sending Leopard II tanks is that they wouldn't do it unless the United States provided one of their most modern tanks, the M1 Abrams tank, and sent that to Ukraine itself. However, the Americans had also been hesitant to do this. The Americans also have the added reason that the M1 Abrams is quite a resource-intensive tank, which isn't the best when you have a stretched supply line, as well as the fact that, of course, the M1 Abrams are mostly stored in the United States, so they'd have to actually be shipped over to Europe and to Ukraine, which is a whole logistical nightmare. Whereas countries like Poland and some of the Central European countries that own Leopard tanks, they would quite literally be able to drive them across the border and they'd be in Ukraine and ready to go. However, on the 25th of January, the Americans had a change of heart and they decided that they would indeed in the Senate, they decided that they would send the M1 Abrams tanks, a number of them, to Ukraine, thus urging the Germans to do something similar. And the Germans appear to have followed suit. And on the same day, Olaf Scholz announced that he would also be sending a number of Leopard 2, I believe it's 14 Leopard 2s, so matching the same number of Challenger 2s that the British are sending to Ukraine, and that he would also send them. But of course, this means that with Germany sending Leopard 2 tanks, that opens the way for other NATO allies, notably Poland, and I believe Spain, Finland, and Portugal had also said that they might send their own tanks or a few of their own tanks to Ukraine. That meant that they can also send them. The question now is, of course, that the Ukrainians will need some time to learn how to use these tanks, and whether this will come in time for the main push of the spring offensive, which we assume may begin in March or in April. We will also have to see how these tanks actually do on the battlefield, and whether they will be as transformative as the Ukrainians hope when in Ukrainian hands. But for now, at least, it seems that the West, after quite a while of dispute and disunity, have come together and agreed upon a strategy in terms of tanks for Ukraine. Alright everyone, thank you very much for watching this video about the Leopard 2 tank and why it's taken a while to get to Ukraine, and the various sides in the argument from the German side, the Polish side, and the Ukrainian side. Let me know if you found this interesting. It's been a while since I covered some things about Ukraine, but I thought it was quite interesting to look here at why it had taken a while for the German government to agree upon a strategy in terms of the tanks. I can sort of see a little bit about both sides. Obviously, the Ukrainians are desperate for heavier and better weapons so that they hope they can end the war faster with a spring offensive when the better weather returns in the new year. But the Germans, of course, with their history, have a long-standing tradition now of pacifism and not wanting to escalate military situations, particularly in sensitive areas where they were engaged in the 20th century. But anyway, in the meantime, I have been Hilbert. More content will be uploaded next week on Friday or Saturday, and I will see you all again very soon. Take it easy.